There is a moment captured on grainy surveillance footage from a prison security camera that nobody who has ever seen it can quite explain. It is early morning, the kind of morning where fog sits so low and so heavy on the ground that the world looks like it hasn't fully decided to exist yet. The prison gate is massive iron and concrete and chain link, the kind of structure built specifically to remind people on both sides of it that there is no in-between. Guards move through their routines with the mechanical efficiency of people who have learned to stop noticing where they are. And there, just beyond the gate, sitting perfectly still in the gray morning light is a dog. Golden, medium-sized, ears slightly too large for his head, sitting the way dogs sit when they are waiting for something they are absolutely certain is coming. The guard walks past him. The dog doesn't move. Another hour passes. A shift changes. Two men in uniform walk out, glance down, say something to each other, and keep going. The dog doesn't move. The fog burns off. The sun climbs. The day fills itself in around him like water filling a glass, and the dog doesn't move. He was there the next morning, and the morning after that, through summer heat that cracked the asphalt and winter cold that turned the puddles to glass, through rain that soaked him to the skin and days so blindingly bright the guards had to shield their eyes just to look in his direction. Every single morning, same spot, same stillness, same quiet, unshakable certainty in those eyes. For 6 years, that dog sat outside the gates of Hale Creek Penitentiary, and nobody, not the guards, not the ward, not the people who began leaving food and water for him, not the neighbors who started calling him a local legend, nobody could fully explain why. Until the day he finally stopped. And what happened after that will make you question everything you think you know about loyalty, about justice, and about who or what is truly watching when the world decides to look away. His name was Marcus Hale, and if you had asked anyone in the small town of Calvert, Georgia, to point you toward the last person they'd expect to find in a state penitentiary, most of them without hesitation would have pointed you to him. Marcus was 34 years old when his life was taken from him. Not ended. Taken. There is a difference, and this story lives entirely inside that difference. He was the kind of man who existed quiet, not because he had nothing to offer, but because the world had given him very little reason to believe that loudness led anywhere good. He worked the night shift at a warehouse on the edge of town, a wide, fluorescent-lit building that hummed with conveyor belts and the smell of cardboard and machine oil. He showed up on time. He did his work. He walked home before sunrise. His neighbors remembered him the way people remember someone who made the world feel slightly safer without ever asking for credit. The elderly woman 3 doors down, Miss Evelyn, who had lived alone since her husband passed, would come home to find her broken fence post replaced. No note, no knock on the door. The stray cats behind the gas station were never quite as thin as they should have been for strays. Nobody could prove it was Marcus, but nobody doubted it either. He had no criminal record, no history of violence, no enemies worth naming, no debts worth filling over, no story that could explain how a man like this ended up wearing a prison number. And yet 7 years ago, that is exactly what happened. He was convicted of a crime so serious, so violently out of character with everything anyone knew about him, that people in Calverton spent weeks afterwards standing in their driveways talking about it in low, confused voices. 18 years. That was the sentence. 18 years inside Hale Creek, a state penitentiary 40 minutes outside of town, surrounded by pine trees and silence and iron. And in all those years, in all those visiting hours, all those weekends, all those holidays, not a single person came to sit across from him in that visitation room. No family, no old friends, no one to slide a letter under the security glass or wave from a parking lot. No one, that is, except a dog. A golden mixed breed with ears too big for his head, sitting outside the east gate every morning like he had somewhere specific to be and had simply chosen here. How does a dog know where its owner is in prison? How does an animal with no map, no address, no concept of the legal system that ripped his person away, how does he find his way to the exact gate of the exact facility where that person is being held? And perhaps more haunting still, why did no human ever come? To understand what Buddy meant to Marcus, you have to understand what Marcus's life looked like before any of this. Because the story of a man and his dog is never really just a story about a man and his dog. It is always, underneath it, a story about belonging. Marcus grew up in the Georgia foster care system. He moved 11 times before he was 16. 11 different houses, 11 different sets of rules, 11 different versions of the same unspoken message: you are here temporarily. He learned early to travel light emotionally and otherwise. He learned that attachment was a liability, that loving something too much was just giving the world a more specific target. By the time he aged out of the system at 18, he had exactly one person he trusted, a boy named Darnell, who had been in and out of the same foster placements for years and who understood, without either of them ever saying, that they were all the family the other one had. Marcus found his warehouse job, and built his life around the architecture of smallness. Small needs, small footprint, small hope. And then, one Tuesday evening behind the gas station 2 blocks from his apartment, he heard a sound coming from inside a dumpster. He almost kept walking. He has said this himself. He almost kept walking. Inside, wrapped in a gas station receipt and a torn piece of flannel, was a puppy, 6 weeks old at most. Golden, with those oversized ears already announcing themselves, eyes barely open, shaking. Marcus stood there for a long moment, and then he took off his jacket, wrapped the puppy inside it, and carried him home. He named him Buddy, not with any great poetry, just with the simple, honest directness of of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at. A companion. The first one he'd ever truly chosen, and the first one who had ever truly chosen him back. Darnell would later say that Marcus changed after Buddy. Not dramatically. Marcus was never a dramatic man, but something in him loosened. Something that had been braced against the world for 20-something years finally, quietly, let go. If you saw Marcus on the street, Buddy was 3 steps behind. When Marcus worked nights, Buddy slept on the floor beside his cot and raised his head at the sound of the key in the lock when Marcus came home every single morning, without fail. Buddy wasn't a pet. He was proof. Proof that Marcus existed. Proof that someone was waiting. Proof that the apartment was a home and not just a place to sleep. And then, on a night in October, 7 years ago, everything that Marcus had built inside that smallness was destroyed in a single act of calculated, deliberate cruelty. Not by a fire, though there was a fire. By a lie. The kind of lie that wears a badge. October 14 arrived the way disaster always does, dressed as an ordinary day. Marcus had worked his shift, walked home through the cool Georgia night, and fallen asleep with Buddy curled at the foot of his cot. He had no reason to think about Raymond Stokes. Most people in Calverton tried not to. Stokes was the kind of man who had made himself impossible to ignore, a real estate developer whose name appeared on half the construction signs in the town, whose handshake deals had a way of becoming permanent arrangements whether the other party remembered agreeing or not. He wore expensive shirts to casual meetings and had the particular brand of confidence that comes not from achievement but from a lifetime of consequence-free behavior. He had enemies. That was not a secret. In a town like Calvert, wealth earned through displacement has a long memory attached to it. Families who had been pushed out of their homes, small business owners who had watched their leases disappear under legal language they couldn't afford to challenge, local officials who knew exactly what Stokes was and had decided quiet that knowing was enough. His business partner was a man named Gerald Mott. Quieter than Stokes, less visible, the kind of man who did the paperwork while someone else did the talk. They had built their company together over 10 years, and for most of that time, Gerald had played his role without complaint. But something had shifted in the months before October. People who knew Gerald said he seemed different, distracted, careful with his words in a way he hadn't been before, like a man who had found something he didn't want to be holding. The fire started just after midnight. It tore through Raymond Stokes's property with the kind of speed that investigators would later note, in careful, neutral language, was consistent with accelerant use. Raymond got out. He was found 2 blocks away, shaken, with minor burns on his hands. Gerald Mott did not get out. The town woke up to the news the way small towns wake up to tragedy all at once, in fragments, standing in doorways with coffee cups going cold. There was grief for Gerald, who most people had liked. There was a particular, complicated silence around Stokes, the silence of people who had thoughts they hadn't decided whether to say out loud yet. And then, 72 hours later, before the ash had fully cooled, before Gerald's family had finished making arrangements, before anyone had drawn a breath, Marcus Hale was arrested. The evidence, in its entirety, was a single warehouse access badge, found near the perimeter of the property, belonging to Marcus, issued by the warehouse where he worked the night shift. That was it. That was the whole architecture of the case against him. Marcus told his story clearly from the first moment anyone asked. 3 weeks before the fire, he had lost the badge during his shift. He'd noticed it missing at the end of his workday, retraced his steps, couldn't find it. He had filed a report with warehouse manager. He had gone home and thought very little more about it, because a missing access badge felt, at the time, like a minor administrative inconvenience and not like a weapon being loaded. The missing badge report existed. He had filed it. There was documentation. There were signatures, the quiet paper trail of a man with nothing to hide doing exactly what he was supposed to do. Except that when investigators looked, the report wasn't there. Not deleted, not disputed, simply gone. The record had vanished from the database as cleanly as if it had never existed. And in its absence, the badge became something else entirely. It became motive. It became presence. It became, in the hands of a legal system moving at a speed that should have alarmed everyone involved, a conviction. The detective who led the investigation was named Colby Walsh. Walsh was 17 years on the force. Steady record, unremarkable commendations. The kind of career that didn't attract attention in either direction. He moved through the Marcus Hale case with a focus that his colleagues would later describe, in retrospect, as unusual. Every lead pointed away from Marcus was documented and then quietly set aside. Every question about the timeline, about how Marcus could have been at a property he had no connection to, with no vehicle of his own, on a night when multiple neighbors placed him at home, was absorbed into the momentum of the investigation without ever being fully answered. Walsh was certain. Walsh was efficient. Walsh was done in 72 hours. Marcus had a public defender, a young man, overworked and underfunded, who sat with his client for 11 minutes before the trial began. Not 11 hours. 11 minutes. Long enough to review the badge, confirm the missing report was gone, and conclude with the particular exhausted pragmatism of someone who has lost this kind of case before, that the odds were not in their favor. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. When the verdict came back, Marcus sat very still. Darnell, who had taken the day off work to be in that courtroom, said later that Marcus didn't react the way you'd expect. No collapse, no outburst, no visible break. He just went very quiet. Like a man who had always known, somewhere deep and wordless, that the world was capable of this. Like a man whose whole life had been practiced for the moment when the floor disappeared. 18 years. That was what they gave him. And someone somewhere in that courtroom, or in the offices behind it, or in the conversation that nobody was supposed to know about knew that an innocent man had just been swallowed by a system that had been pointed at him on purpose. The night before the transport, Darnell came to say goodbye. He brought food. Marcus liked a specific brand of honey crackers from the gas station, the kind they'd eaten as kids in their third foster place in a house that smelled like pine cleaner and old carpet. He brought them because he didn't know what else to bring. What do you bring a man who is about to be taken somewhere you cannot follow? Buddy was in the back of Darnell's car. He'd been staying there since Marcus's arrest. Darnell had taken him without being asked because the alternative was unthinkable, and because somewhere in his chest he believed, the way you believe things you can't quite justify, that keeping Buddy safe was a way of keeping some part of Marcus safe too. When Darnell pulled up to the facility where Marcus was being held for the night, Buddy stood up in the back seat. His nose went to the window. His tail, which had barely moved in weeks, began to tremble. Marcus came to the window of the visitation room and pressed his hand flat against the glass. And Buddy on the other side, in the parking lot, separated by distance and angle and everything else, went absolutely still and stared directly at where Marcus was standing. As if he knew, as if he had always known. Darnell drove away when visiting hours ended. He was 2 miles down the road when he heard the sound, not a bark, not a whimper, but the specific thud of a car door that hadn't been fully latched giving way to 40 pounds of determined animal. He pulled over. He searched the darks. He called the name until his voice went rough. Buddy was gone. By the next morning, by the time the transport van carrying Marcus Hale rolled through the gates of Hale Creek Penitentiary and the doors sealed behind him, a golden dog with oversized ears was already sitting at the east gate. 23 miles of rural Georgia backroads. In the dark, with no trail, no scent to follow, no logical explanation for how he knew which direction to go, let alone which facility, let alone which gate. Darnell found him there, took him home. 2 days later, Buddy was back at the gate before dawn. He took him home again, and again. 4 times in total, Darnell made the drive, lifted the dog gently into the back seat, spoke to him in the low, reassuring voice of a man trying to hold something together. 4 times, within 24 hours, Buddy was back at the gate. On the 5th attempt, Darnell sat in the parking lot for a long time with the engine running, and then he left without getting out of the car, because he understood, in the way you understand things that are bigger than reason, that Buddy was not lost. Buddy was not confused. Buddy was not a dog who had wandered somewhere by accident and didn't know how to get home. Buddy was home. The years passed with the specific cruelty of time inside and injustice slow on the inside, invisible from the outside. Marcus served his sentence. Darnell visited when he could and wrote letters that Marcus folded carefully and kept, though the letters grew shorter as the years grew longer, the way all things do under the weight of a loss that has no end date. And every morning, at the east gate of Hale Creek Penitentiary, a golden dog sat down and waited. The guards stopped being surprised and started being protective. They left water in a bowl near the fence post. Someone began leaving food kibble at first, then real scrap from the staff cafeteria, the kind of soft, warm food you give an animal you have quietly decided is yours to look after. They named him. Different guards had different names for him: Ghost, Faithful, Goldie, but the name that stuck, the one that spread through the facility until even the warden used it without irony, was Buddy. Nobody knew that was already his name. For 6 years, the routine held: arrive at dawn, sit at the east gate, leave at dusk, come back tomorrow, until the spring of the 6th year, until the Tuesday mornings when a black truck began to slow near the service road, until Buddy stood up for the first time in years and started to pace, until something shifted in those old, patient eyes, something that looked, to the people watching, less like waiting and more like recognition. Something was coming, and Buddy knew it before any of them did. There is a particular kind of attention that animals pay to the world that human beings have mostly forgotten how to access. We filter, we categorize, we decide before we have even fully looked what is worth seeing and what is not. We walk past the same corner 100 times and never once consider that the corner is trying to tell us something. Buddy had no such filter. He had spent 6 years watching the world from the same fixed point, the east gate of Hale Creek Penitentiary, with the pure, unbroken attention of a creature who had nothing else to do but notice. He knew every guard's footstep. He knew which cars belonged to staff and which belonged to families. He knew the sound of the morning shift change and the smell of the kitchen exhaust and the exact quality of light that meant the sun was about to clear the tree line to the east. And in the spring of the 6th year, something new entered his world. It arrived on a Tuesday. A black truck, older model, dark windows, moving slowly along the service road that ran parallel to the prison's western perimeter. Most people wouldn't have registered it. Service road, see trucks pass. The world is full of unremarkable vehicles doing unremarkable things. But Buddy stood up. For the first time in anyone's memory, he left his spot at the east gate and moved deliberately, purposefully toward the fence line nearest the service road. He stood there with his nose working the air and his body rigid, not with fear but with something more focused than fear, something closer to recognition. The truck slowed almost imperceptibly as it passed. Then it continued on, turned at the county road junction, and was gone. The following Tuesday, it came back, and the Tuesday after that. By the 4th Tuesday, Buddy was at the fence line before the truck appeared, as if he had built the schedule into himself the way he had built everything else into himself. Through repetition and attention and a kind of knowing that didn't require explanation, he began to bark. Not the panic bark of a frightened animal, but something sharp, more deliberate. The bark of a dog pointing at something and demanding that someone look. The guards noticed. How could they they not? In 6 years, Buddy had never barked like that. In 6 years, Buddy had barely moved. Most of them filed it away under the broad and comfortable category of strange things animals do and return to their routine. But one of them didn't. Her name was Priya Anand, 26 years old, 8 months into her first posting, still in the phase of the job where things register as interesting rather than routine. She had grown up with dogs, 3 of them, in a noisy household in Savannah where the animals were members of the family and were treated accordingly, and she recognized something in Buddy's behavior that the older guards, with their cultivated indifference, had trained themselves not to see. He wasn't reacting. He was responding. There is a difference. A dog who reacts is startled, defensive, operating from instinct without intention. A dog who responds has assessed something and made a decision. Buddy's body language every Tuesday was organized in a way that Priya, standing there in the early morning with her coffee going cold in her hand, found impossible to dismiss. She started filming, not with any particular plan, just with her phone held casually, pointed toward the fence line on Tuesday mornings when the truck came around. She filmed Buddy's posture, the direction of his attention, the moment the truck appeared and the moment it left. She filmed the way his focus didn't waver. She filmed the way he moved to the same spot on the fence line within minutes of the truck's arrival, before it was even visible, as if he could detect it by something other than sight. She posted the videos to a local Facebook group, a small community page for the town nearest the prison, the kind of group that normally traded posts about lost cats and county fair announcements. Her caption was simple: "Our guy Buddy has been doing something strange every Tuesday. Anyone know whose truck this is?" She expected a few comments. Maybe someone would recognize the vehicle. Maybe someone would offer an explanation she hadn't thought of. What she did not expect was Carol Sims. Carol Sims was 61 years old and had spent 32 of those years as an investigative journalist for a mid-sized Georgia newspaper before retiring, or being retired depending on whose version of the story you preferred, 4 years earlier when the paper downsized and Carol's particular brand of careful, slow, unglamorous investigation became an expense that quarterly projections couldn't justify. She still read everything. Old habit. She followed 17 local Facebook groups across 4 counties, not because she was looking for anything specific but because that is what investigative journalists do. They keep the intake valve open and wait for the thing that doesn't fit. The videos of Buddy fit everything she already knew. Carol had covered Marcus Hale's trial 7 years ago. She had sat in that courtroom for all 4 hours of deliberation and felt, in the specific way of someone who has spent decades learning to read the rhythm of legal proceeding, that something was badly wrong. The case had moved too fast. The evidence was too thin. The detective Walsh had given his testimony with the practiced smoothness of a man who had rehearsed it many times in a room that was not a court. She had written a piece raising questions about the timeline. Her editor had cut the most pointed sections. The paper had run something cautious and qualified that satisfied no one and challenged nothing. She had never stopped thinking about it. She watched Priya's videos 3 times. Then she looked up the partial play visible in the clearest footage, a 3-character sequence caught in one clip as the truck slowed near the fence, and began the methodical, unglamorous work that had defined her career. County vehicle records, registration databases, shell company filings, the particular paper maze that exists specifically to make it difficult for people like Carol to find what they're looking for. It took her 11 days. The truck was registered to a company called Meridian Property Solutions. Meridian Property Solutions was a subsidiary of a holding group called Coastal Assets LLC. Coastal Assets LLC had a registered agent whose address was a mail forwarding service in Savannah and whose listed direct, buried 4 layers down in documents that required 3 separate FOIA requests to access, was Raymond Stokes. Carol sat back in her chair and stayed very still for a long time. Then she started pulling on the other thread. Detective Colby Walsh had retired 14 months after Marcus's conviction. This was not, by itself, suspicious. Men retire, careers end, people move on. But Walsh had retired at 51, which was young, and had done so without the pension-maximizing delay that most officers in his position would have chosen, which suggested he had income coming from somewhere that made the pension less urgent. The Lake House appeared in county property record 8 months after the conviction. A 4-bedroom property on the eastern shore of Lake Hartwell, purchased outright, no mortgage, for $340,000. Walsh's disclosed salary at retirement made this impossible without a substantial secondary source of funds. Carol documented it. She documented the timeline of the purchase. She documented the gap between Walsh's retirement income and the property's value. She documented the fact that Walsh had, in the months following Marcus's conviction, been seen socially on multiple occasions at events connected to Raymond Stokes's development company, charity dinners, groundbreaking ceremonies, the kind of public occasion that create photographs which end up in newspaper archives that retired journalists know exactly how to search. And then she filed the FOIA request that changed everything. The request was for all documentation connected to Marcus Hale's arrest and booking, including all incident reports and internal communications filed within the 30 days prior to his arrest. It was a broad request, deliberately so. Carol had learned over 30 years that you ask for the wide net and sort through the catch after. What came back 6 weeks later in a manila envelope that she opened at her kitchen table on a Wednesday morning included something that should not have existed. A cross-referenced archive entry. A clerical anomaly, the kind that happens when someone moves a document in a hurry and doesn't fully cover their their tracks. It was a redirect tag, a small piece of administrative notation indicating that a document had been moved from one case file to another. The original file number corresponded to Marcus Hale's booking record. The destination file number corresponded to a completely unrelated case of property dispute from 2 years later that had nothing to do with Marcus, with Walsh, or with the fire. Carol pulled the destination file. Inside, filed between two unrelated pieces of paperwork as if someone had simply needed a place to put something they couldn't destroy but needed to make disappear, was Marcus Hale's missing badge report. Date filed 3 weeks before the fire. Signed by Marcus. Countersigned by a warehouse supervisor. Complete. Legitimate. Exactly as Marcus had always said it was. Someone had moved it. Someone with access to the department's internal filing system. Someone who understood that an innocent man's missing badge report was the one piece of evidence that could unravel a conviction built on nothing else. Carol's hands were steady when she picked up the phone. She had been in this moment before, the moment when the thing you suspected becomes the thing you can prove, and she knew better than to let her hands shake now. There was too much work still to do. She called a pro bono legal organization in Atlanta that specialized in wrongful conviction. She called a federal attorney she had dealt with 12 years ago on a corruption case and whose direct line she had never deleted. She assembled her documentation into a package so meticulous that the attorney, upon receiving it, would later say it was the most organized submission he had seen in 20 years of practice. And then, because she was Carol Sims and she had been doing this for 32 years and she understood that evidence without story goes nowhere, she wrote the article. Not for her old paper, which would have cut it again. For a national publication that had reached out twice in recent years and been told both times that she was retired and had nothing to say. She had something to say now. The article ran on a Thursday. By Friday morning it had been shared 40,000 times. By Saturday it had 120,000. The comments were not the usual noise of internet outrage. They were people who had grown up in towns like Calvert, people who recognized the machinery of the injustice Carol was describing because they had watched it operate on someone they knew, people who had been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to say the thing out loud. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, in the comment threads and the shared posts and the phone calls flooding into the pro bono legal office in Atlanta, was the story of the dog at the gate. The dog who had sat outside a prison for 6 years. The dog who had started barking at a black truck. The dog who had, in his patient, wordless, completely inexplicable way, pointed a retired journalist at a truck connected to the man who had destroyed his owner's life. People said it was coincidence. People said it was instinct. People said dogs can smell things human beings can't. Chemicals, stress hormones, the particular scent of guilt encoded in a person's physiology. Maybe all of those things were true. But Carol, who was not a sentimental woman and had not become one, wrote one line in her article that nobody disputed. What everybody knew, he knew it before any of us. And he never stopped trying to tell someone. Raymond Stokes had spent 7 years believing he was safe. He had built his safety carefully, not just through Walsh, not just through the planted act, but through the accumulated weight of a life lived without consequence. He had survived Gerald Mott. He had survived the investigation. He had survived the newspaper piece that Carol had tried to write and that his attorney had helped neutralize through a quiet conversation with her editor. He had survived because the system, when you know how to use it, is extraordinarily good at protecting the people who know how to use it. What he had not survived was a dog. And what he was about to discover, what was hurtling toward him now with the momentum of a truth that had been compressed for 7 years and was finally violently decompressing, was that Walsh had not been the loyal soldier he had paid for. Walsh had been keeping receipts. There is a particular kind of man who, when he finally understands that the walls are closing, does not think about the person he destroyed. He thinks about himself. He calculates. He measures the distance between what he has done and what can still be proven, and he looks for the narrowest possible exit through which he can drag whatever remains of his hum. Colby Walsh was that kind of man. For 7 years, he had lived on the eastern shore of Lake Hartwell in a 4-bedroom house he had no legitimate reason to own, and he had slept, if not well, then adequately, because adequately is what you settle for when you have made the choices Walsh had made. He told himself the story that men like him always tell, that Marcus Hale would have ended up somewhere like this eventually, that the system had simply accelerated an inevitable conclusion, that the bad was just a tool and tools don't have morality, only the hands that use them do. He had kept the files because he was not stupid. Raymond Stokes was a man who disposed of problems, and Walsh had seen, up close, exactly how thorough that disposal could be. Gerald Mott had gone to the police 2 days before the fire. Walsh knew this because he had been the officer who took Gerald's initial statement, a statement that had never made it into any official record, that Walsh had driven home and burned in his backyard fireplace on a cold November evening while the flames reflected in the windows of the house Gerald would never get to warn anyone about. Walsh had known everything. He had participated in everything. And he had understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent 17 years reading other people's mistakes, that the only thing standing between him and Raymond Stokes' particular brand of problem solving was the fact that Raymond needed him to stay quiet, and that Raymond would only need him to stay quiet for as long as Walsh had nothing to say. So he had kept the files, original evidence, Gerald's state, documentation of the conversation between himself and Raymond in the weeks before the fire, the badge report, everything organized and stored in a unit rented under his wife's maiden name, accessed by a courier every few months to rotate new material and to remind Raymond Stokes without ever saying it directly that the arrangement between them was ongoing and that its terms were non-negotiable. It was blackmail dressed in the language of insurance. Raymond paid. Walsh was comfortable. And Marcus Hale served his sentence in a prison 40 minutes outside of town while a dog sat at his gate and the truth moldered in a storage unit off Interstate 85. Until Carol Sims sent her package to a federal attorney. Until that attorney, a precise, unhurried man named Douglas Farrell, who had spent 2 decades watching men like Walsh calculate their exits, picked up his phone and made a call that Walsh did not see coming because Walsh had been watching for Raymond to move against him and had never once considered that the threat would arrive from a direction he hadn't thought to monitor. Farrell's team found the storage unit in 6 days. Walsh's wife's maiden name, once you were looking for it, appeared in the rental records with the straightforward legibility of a document that had been hidden by someone who believed no one would ever look. Inside the unit, in 6 archival boxes stacked with the neat, anxious organization of a man who had spent years terrified of his own evidence, was everything. Everything. Walsh broke in the first interview. Not because he was weak, he had, in another sense, been strong enough to carry this for 7 years, but because the specific exhaustion of a man who has been waiting to be caught is different from the exhaustion of a man who believes he is safe. And Walsh had known, somewhere beneath the comfortable numbness of the lake house and the pension and the quiet Tuesday courier, that this was always going to end. He gave them Raymond Stokes. He gave them dates and amounts and conversations and the name of the attorney who had helped neutralize Carol's first article. He gave them Gerald Mott's original statement, the statement of a dead man who had tried to do the right thing and had been silenced before he could finish, and in doing so gave Gerald, in some small and insufficient way, a testimony he had never been allowed to deliver. In exchange, Walsh received a plea agreement that would keep him out of the worst of what he deserved. This is the part of the story that doesn't feel like justice, the part where the man who built the lie gets to negotiate the terms of his own accountability while the man who lived inside the lie spent 6 years watching a dog through a prison window. There is no clean resolution to that imbalance. It exists. It is part of this story, and to tell it otherwise would be to commit the same crime the system committed when it decided that Marcus Hale's innocence was less important than someone else's convenience. But Raymond Stokes did not get a plea agreement. Raymond was arrested on a Tuesday morning, early before the lake had fully caught the light, before the birds had started, in the particular stillness that precedes a Georgia dawn. He was in his kitchen when the federal agents arrived, wearing a robe and holding a coffee cup, and the expression on his face, according to one of the agents present who would describe it years later, was not the expression of a man who was surprised. It was the expression of a man who had been waiting for a knock on the door for 7 years and had simply, through practice and denial and the relentless forward motion of a life built on impunity, managed to forget that he was waiting. He was charged with arson, murder, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and a separate 11-count indictment related to the land fraud scheme that Gerald Mott had been about to expose, the scheme that had displaced hundreds of families, demolished affordable housing, erased communities, and, in its particular and devastating specificity, torn down the foster home in Elbert County where a boy named Marcus had lived for 2 years at age 9 and called it, cautiously, something like home. Raymond Stokes had taken everything from Marcus, not once, twice. First the childhood, then the life. At Hale Creek Penitentiary, on the same Tuesday morning that Raymond was being led to a federal vehicle in handcuffs, a guard named Priya Anand was beginning her shift when she noticed something. Buddy was at the fence line, the spot where he had paced and barked every Tuesday for months. But he wasn't barking. He wasn't pacing. He was sitting, perfectly, completely, absolutely still. His head was up. His ears, those oversized, earnest ears, were forward. And his eyes were fixed on a point in the middle distance with an expression that Priya, who had grown up with dogs and knew their vocabulary intimate, would later struggle to describe. She said it looked like relief. She said it looked like a dog who had finished something. The legal process moved, once it moved, with the purposeful speed of a system correcting a wrong it would prefer not to have made. Marcus's conviction was formally vacated 11 weeks after Raymond's arrest. The paperwork was filed on a Wednesday. The release was scheduled for the following Thursday. Darnell got the call on a Wednesday evening and sat in his truck in the parking lot of the grocery store for 20 minutes before he trusted himself to drive. He called Priya, who had given him her number the day Carol's article ran. Priya cleared her Thursday schedule without hesitation. She drove 4 hours the night before and slept in her car in a parking lot 2 miles from the prison because she had decided, with the quiet conviction of a woman who understood that some moments require witnesses, that she was going to be there. Darnell picked up Buddy that Thursday morning at 5 o'clock, earlier than necessary, but neither of them could sleep. He loaded him gently into the back seat. Buddy was 7 years old now. His muzzle had begun to gray in the way of older dogs, not dramatic but noticeably, a soft frosting around his nose and along his jaw that hadn't been there when this started. He moved with the slight deliberateness of a body that has spent years sitting on cold pavement in all weather, the particular stiffness of loyalty made physical. He sat in the back seat and looked out the window at the darkness. Marcus Hale walked out of Hale Creek Penitentiary at 7:43 in the morning. He was wearing the same jacket he had been wearing when they brought him, in a dark green canvas jacket that Darnell had asked the facility to keep for him and that they had, in a gesture of institutional grace that nobody had been required to make, actually had. He was carrying a folded letter, the last one Darnell had sent, the one Marcus had held on to through every transfer transfer, every reassignment, every morning that was indistinguishable from the one before. He had nothing else. He stopped when he came through the outer gate. The air hit him differently out here, the specific quality of air that exists only on the far side of a wall you have been behind for a very long time. He stood still for a moment, not dramatically, just quietly, the way a man recalibrates himself after a long time of having no reason to recalibrate. Then he saw Darnell. They embraced without words, the way men embrace when words have already been used up by years of letters and visits and phone calls and have been reduced finally to something simpler and more complete than language. And then Marcus looked past Darnell's shoulder. Buddy was standing beside the car. He had not run. He had not barked. When Darnell opened the door and he had stepped out, he had simply stood there 20 feet away in the thin morning light, looking at the man he had been waiting for. For a moment neither of them moved. 6 years. 2,190 mornings. 2,190 times that Buddy had made the choice, and it had always been a choice. Whatever anyone wanted to say about instinct and animal behavior, it had always been a deliberate, daily, renewed choice to come back to that gate and wait. Marcus's knees hit the asphalt before he had consciously decided to move, and Buddy slowly, with the measured dignity of an animal who has earned every step, crossed the distance between them. Not in a rush, not in the frantic, overwhelming way of a reunion that has been too long delayed. In 3 steps, careful, deliberate, certain. And then he walked into Marcus's arms and stayed there. Marcus's face was pressed into the top of Buddy's head. His shoulders shook once, then steady. Buddy's tail moved, not the frantic wagging of excitement, but something slower and deeper, the rhythm of a thing that has been wound tight for a very long time, finally releasing. Priya filmed it from 20 feet away. She had stopped crying by the time she started filming and started again halfway through and didn't stop until it was over. Nobody spoke for almost 2 minutes. The cold Thursday morning held them all in a particular stillness. Marcus on the asphalt, Buddy in his arms, Darnell standing with his hand over his mouth, Priya with her phone and her tears and her 4-hour drive that she would never for the rest of her life regret. And above them the sky did what skies do, indifferently and beautifully turned from gray to pale gold as the sun cleared the tree line, the same tree line Buddy had watched every morning for 6 years from the other side of that fence. Raymond Stokes was sentenced 14 months later, 22 years. The judge's remarks were brief and precise and contained, in their measured legal language, something that functioned as fury. Gerald Mott's family was in the courtroom. The families of some of the displaced communities were there too, people who had lost homes and neighborhood and the particular irreplaceable thing that is a place you grew up in, gathered in that room not because the verdict would return what they had lost but because it would acknowledge, in the only language the system speaks, that the loss had been real and the cause had been a man who was now being held accountable. Walsh received his plea agreement. He served time. He sold the lake house. There is not much more to say about Colby Walsh. He is the kind of man whose story ends in subtraction, in the slow removal of the things he had accumulated through damage, and whatever remains of him afterward is simply what was always there underneath, less than he believed and more than he deserved. Carroll's article The Full Investigation, expanded and documented, was published as a long-form piece that won 2 National Journalism Awards and, more important, triggered a formal review of 4 additional convictions tied to Walsh's caseload. 3 of those reviews are ongoing. One man, a 44-year-old from Augusta who had served 9 years for a crime with Walsh's fingerprints all over its investigation, walked out of prison 6 months after Marcus did. He had no dog waiting at the gate, but Marcus sent him a letter. Darnell set up a fundraiser. He had no experience with fundraising, no social media following, no particular reason to believe it would reach anyone beyond the people who had already been following the story. He wrote a simple description: Marcus Hale spent 6 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He's out. He needs a start. Anything helps. And attached Priya's video of the reunion at the gate. In 72 hours, it raised enough for a year's rent on a small house on the eastern edge of Calvert. Single story, screen door, a yard with enough space for a dog to lie in the afternoon sun and feel the warmth of it in old bones. Marcus moved in on a Saturday in November. Darnell helped him carry things. There wasn't much to carry. That evening, as the light went amber and the yard filled with the long shadows of late afternoon, Buddy walked through the screen door and lay down in a patch of sunlight just inside the threshold, half in, half out, the way dogs do when they are keeping watch over something they have decided is worth it. Marcus sat in a chair inside and watched him through the screen. He sat there for a long time, not thinking about Raymond Stokes, not thinking about Walsh, not thinking about the courtroom or the 18 years or the badge or the 4 hours the jury took to take his life away. Just sitting, just watching the old dog breathe in the afternoon light, the gray muzzle resting on his paws, the oversized ears tilted slightly toward the sound of Marcus's breathing. Just being, finally, in the same place at the same time, with nowhere else to be. Here is what nobody noticed until much later, what Priya only discovered when she went back through her footage months after the reunion and found a clip she hadn't looked closely before. In the video she took on the last Tuesday before Raymond's arrest, the morning Buddy sat still at the fence line for the first time in months, she had kept the camera rolling for almost 4 minutes. In the final 30 seconds of the clip, as Buddy remained perfectly motionless at the fence, you can see the exact moment his posture shifts. Not dramatically, just slightly, a barely perceptible lowering of the head, a settling of the body. It looks, in the footage, like a dog who has finished a job. out. It looks like a dog who knows. He couldn't read a verdict. No framework for wrongful conviction. No concept of the machinery that had separated him from the person he loved. He had only the morning, and the gate, and the choice, made fresh each dawn, to come back. For 2,190 days, that choice was the only testimony that couldn't be buried, couldn't be moved to a different case file, couldn't be by guards who brought him water, by a young woman with a phone and 4 hours of highway and the instinct to keep the camera rolling, by a retired journalist who had never stopped believing that the thing she felt in that courtroom 7 years ago was not paranoia but knowledge. And maybe in the way that truth sometimes operates, slowly and without announcement, through the most unexpected and undefendable channels, it was witnessed by whatever in the universe keeps account of the things that are done in the dark and the things that are done in the light. Loyalty without language is the purest form of love. It cannot be cross-examined. It cannot be discredited. It carries no agenda and requests no reward and performs for no audience. It simply shows up every morning, at the gate, in the fog, until the gate opens. And in the end that was enough.